Imagine a time shrouded in myth, a world of glittering palaces, fearsome warriors, and legendary monsters. This isn't a fantasy novel. This was the reality of the Bronze Age Aegean, a period so dramatic and foundational that we still tell its stories today. Welcome to the first chapter of our journey into ancient Greece, the Age of Heroes. Our story begins not on the Greek mainland, but on the sun-drenched island of Crete. Around 3000 BCE, here, a remarkable civilization blossomed, the Minoans. They weren't Greeks, and they didn't speak Greek, but their influence would echo through the ages. The Minoans were master seafarers, their ships dominating the trade routes of the eastern Mediterranean. They built sprawling, labyrinthine palace complexes, like the legendary one at Knossos, so vast and confusing that it likely inspired the myth of the Minotaur and the labyrinth. These palaces weren't grim fortresses. They were vibrant centers of art, religion, and administration, decorated with stunning frescoes of leaping dolphins, elegant processions, and daring acrobats somersaulting over charging bulls. This was a sophisticated, and by all appearances, a remarkably peaceful society. Their cities lacked massive defensive walls, suggesting they felt secure on their island home, protected by the sea and their powerful navy. They developed a unique writing system known as Linear A, which to this day remains undeciphered, a silent testament to their lost world. The Minoan culture was one of grace, art, and maritime power, a beacon of civilization in the early Bronze Age. But their golden age wouldn't last forever. Around 1700 BCE, a cataclysmic volcanic eruption on the nearby island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, sent shockwaves across the Aegean. Tsunamis and a thick blanket of ash likely devastated Minoan coastal towns and agriculture. While their civilization survived and even rebuilt, this event may have weakened them, leaving them vulnerable to a new rising power from the north. Enter the Mycenaeans. Descending onto the Greek mainland around 1600 BCE, these were the first people to speak the Greek language. And unlike the peaceful Minoans, the Mycenaeans were a proud and formidable warrior culture. Their society was dominated by a military aristocracy, ruled by powerful kings or wainaks from within immense, cyclopean fortresses. Think of the legendary citadels of Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos. Their walls were built from massive, unworked boulders, so enormous that later Greeks believed they must have been built by the mythical one-eyed giants, the Cyclopes. At the heart of these citadels was the Megaron, a great central hall with a large hearth, which served as the king's throne room, council chamber, and feasting hall. This was the center of Mycenaean power. From these strongholds, Mycenaean warlords controlled their territories, amassed incredible wealth, and waged war. Archaeologists have unearthed spectacular treasures from their tombs, like the so-called Mask of Agamemnon, a golden death mask found at Mycenae, along with exquisite bronze armor, boar's tusk helmets, and swords inlaid with gold and ivory. Their writing system, Linear B, an early form of Greek, has been deciphered. The clay tablets it was written on reveal a highly organized, bureaucratic society focused on accounting for goods like wool, olive oil, and bronze for weapons. They were organized, they were wealthy, and they were warriors. By around 1450 BCE, the Mycenaeans had expanded their influence across the Aegean, even taking control of Knossos on Crete. They adopted and adapted many aspects of Minoan culture, from their art styles to their writing system, but they infused everything with their own martial spirit. This was the world that would give birth to Greece's most enduring legends. This period, from roughly 1600 to 1200 BCE, is the historical backdrop for the epic tales of Homer's Asterisk, Iliad Asterisk, and Asterisk Odyssey Asterisk. The heroes we know, Achilles, Odysseus, Hector, Agamemnon, were Mycenaean kings and warriors. The Trojan War, the legendary 10-year siege of the great city of Troy, was their conflict. For centuries, Troy was considered pure myth. But in the 19th century, archaeologists discovered its ruins in modern-day Turkey, revealing a city that had been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. One of these destruction layers dates to the late Bronze Age, around the time the Trojan War would have taken place, suggesting a historical kernel of truth to Homer's epic. These stories, passed down orally for centuries before being written down, weren't just entertainment. They formed the very foundation of Greek identity. They were a shared history, a collection of moral exemplars, and a source of cultural pride that would unite the disparate city-states of a later age. The Mycenaeans were the ancestors, the great heroes who walked the earth in a bygone golden age. And then it all came crashing down. Around 1200 BCE, the vibrant, interconnected world of the Bronze Age Mediterranean collapsed. In a shockingly short period of time, the great Mycenaean palaces were burned and abandoned. The trade networks that had spanned the sea for centuries were severed. Literacy, the knowledge of writing Linear B, was lost. Cities were depopulated, and the entire complex social structure disintegrated. What happened? This event, known as the Late Bronze Age Collapse, is one of history's greatest mysteries. There isn't one single answer, but rather a perfect storm of calamities. Evidence points to widespread drought and famine, possibly leading to mass internal migrations and social unrest. At the same time, mysterious groups of raiders, known in Egyptian records as the Sea Peoples, were wreaking havoc across the eastern Mediterranean, toppling empires. It's likely a combination of climate change, systems collapse, internal rebellions, and external invasions that brought this heroic age to a sudden, violent end. The world of heroes, of golden masks and cyclopean walls, vanished. Greece plunged into a dark age, a period of poverty, isolation, and fragmentation that would last for centuries. The great palaces fell into ruin, the legends faded into myth, and the memory of this glorious era was kept alive only by the flickering firelight of bards, singing tales of a time when heroes walked the earth. But this was not the end of the story. From these ashes, a new, and perhaps even more influential, Greek civilization would eventually rise. We left our heroes in a dark age, a period of uncertainty and shadow. But as we know, the darkest hour is just before the dawn. And what a dawn it was! Imagine emerging from centuries of relative silence, and the first voices you hear are not whispers, but the thundering verses of epic poetry. This is the Archaic period, a rebirth, a renaissance, all sparked by one legendary name, Homer. The Iliad and the Odyssey weren't just stories. They were the cultural DNA of a reborn Greece. They were tales of heroes and gods, of rage and cunning, of honor and the tragic cost of war. These epics, passed down orally for generations before being written, became the foundation of Greek education, values, and identity. They gave a scattered people a shared past and a common pantheon of heroes to look up to. It was through these stories that the Greeks began to see themselves not just as inhabitants of a particular valley or island, but as Hellenes, a people bound by language, myth, and a glorious, albeit brutal, heritage. As this new cultural identity took root, a revolutionary new form of social and political organization began to blossom across the rocky landscape of Greece, the polis. Now, when you hear polis, don't just think city. A polis, or city-state, was so much more. It was a community, a self-governing entity that included not only the urban center, but also the surrounding countryside. It was the heart of a citizen's life. Your identity was tied to your polis. You weren't just a Greek. You were a Corinthian, a Theban, an Argive, or a Spartan. Each polis was fiercely independent, a little world unto itself with its own laws, its own army, its own gods, and its own unique character. Imagine hundreds of these sovereign city-states dotting the Greek mainland and the Aegean islands, each one a crucible of innovation and competition. This was the fundamental building block of Greek society. The concept of citizenship, of having a say in your own governance, of belonging to a community of equals. These radical ideas were forged in the fire of the polis. It was a political laboratory unlike anything the world had ever seen. But the Greeks were not content to stay put. As populations grew and resources became strained, a great wave of expansion began. This wasn't a military conquest in the traditional sense. It was a movement of people. From roughly 750 to 550 BC, Greek colonists set sail from their home Peleus, embarking on daring voyages across the Mediterranean. They were searching for new land, new opportunities, and new beginnings. Think of it like a cultural explosion. These pioneers established new city-states from the shores of the Black Sea all the way to modern-day Spain and France. Places like Syracuse in Sicily, Naples in Italy, originally Neapolis, the new city, and Marseille in France all began as Greek colonies. And these weren't just outposts. They were new poleis, carrying the torch of Greek culture with them. They brought their language, their religion, their pottery, their architecture, and most importantly, their political ideas. This great colonization was how the Greek world expanded, spreading its influence and transforming the Mediterranean into a Greek lake. This expansion and competition between the poleis created a dynamic and often volatile environment. And out of this cauldron of rivalries, two city-states rose to become the dominant powers, two polar opposites that would come to define the very soul of classical Greece. They were the undisputed heavyweights of the Hellenic world, Sparta and Athens. First, let's talk about Sparta. When you hear Sparta, what comes to mind? Discipline, warriors, a society completely and utterly dedicated to military perfection. And you wouldn't be wrong. Located in the fertile valley of Laconia, the Spartans were a unique and intimidating force. Their entire society was an assembly line for producing the greatest soldiers the world had ever seen. From the age of 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families and entered the Aegean, a brutal state-sponsored training program designed to strip them of their individuality and forge them into unflinching, obedient soldiers of the state. For a Spartan, the state was everything. Personal wealth, luxury, even family ties were secondary to the needs of the polis. They were famous for their laconic wit, using few words, and their contempt for comfort. Life was hard, disciplined, and focused on one goal: the defense and glory of Sparta. Their government was a strange mix of monarchy, oligarchy, and democratic elements, but the true power lay with a council of elders and the warrior class. Sparta was a bastion of tradition, order, and unmatched military might. They were the shield of Greece. And then there was Athens. If Sparta was the shield, Athens was the spearhead of innovation, the cradle of ideas that would change the world forever. Situated in the less fertile region of Attica, Athens turned to the sea, becoming a great trading power. This commercial success brought wealth, but also social tension between the old aristocracy and a rising class of merchants and common citizens. Unlike Sparta, which solved its problems through rigid control, Athens embarked on a messy, brilliant, and unprecedented experiment. Through a series of reforms by leaders like Solon and Cleisthenes, Athens began a slow, often chaotic, journey towards something new: democratia, or rule by the people. They began to believe that every male citizen, regardless of wealth, should have a say in how the city was run. They established assemblies where citizens could debate and vote on laws, and courts with juries of their peers. This was revolutionary. While still far from our modern understanding of democracy, as it excluded women, slaves, and foreigners, it was a radical leap forward. Athens became a hub of art, philosophy, and political thought. It was a city buzzing with energy, argument, and the belief that human potential, unlocked through freedom, was limitless. So here we have the two titans of the Archaic Age: Sparta, the landlocked, conservative, militaristic oligarchy, and Athens, the seafaring, progressive, burgeoning democracy. They were rivals, almost mirror images of each other, representing two different paths a polis could take. One valued the collective over the individual, security over freedom. The other championed individual expression and political participation, even at the risk of instability. The tension between these two city-states, their competing ideologies and ambitions, would set the stage for the next most famous chapter of Greek history, the classical period. The clash between Spartan discipline and Athenian democracy, between the hoplite's shield and the philosopher's mind, would define the destiny of Greece and echo down through the millennia, shaping the very world we live in today. The archaic set the board, and the pieces were now in motion for the greatest game of all: our historical journey. It's a fascinating period, isn't it? If you enjoyed this deep dive, please hit that like button and be sure to subscribe. All right, picture this. You've got dozens of feuding, fiercely independent Greek city-states. They're constantly bickering, competing, and sometimes even at war with each other. Suddenly, on the eastern horizon, a shadow falls. It's the Persian Empire, the largest and most powerful empire the world had ever seen, and it's looking westward. This wasn't just another border dispute. This was an existential threat. The mighty Persians were coming, and for the Greeks, the choice was stark: unite or be conquered. Welcome back to our series on ancient Greece. Today, we're diving into the dramatic, world-shaping conflict known as the Persian Wars. So, how did this epic clash begin? It all started in a region called Ionia, on the coast of modern-day Turkey. These were Greek city-states, but they'd fallen under Persian rule. In 499 BC, they decided they'd had enough and revolted. Athens, feeling a sense of kinship, sent ships and soldiers to help. This was a bold move, maybe even a reckless one. They managed to burn the Persian regional capital of Sardis, which, you can imagine, did not sit well with the Persian king Darius the Great. He was furious. Legend has it that he ordered a servant to whisper in his ear 3 times at every meal, "Master, remember the Athenians." He wasn't going to forget. The revolt was eventually crushed, but for Darius, the matter was far from over. The insolence of Athens had to be punished. The stage was set for the first major invasion of Greece. In 490 BC, a massive Persian fleet carrying thousands of soldiers sailed across the Aegean Sea. Their target was Athens. They landed on a crescent-shaped beach, a plain called Marathon, just 26 miles from the city. The Athenians were in a panic. They were heavily outnumbered. They sent a runner named Phidippides on a legendary non-stop sprint to Sparta to beg for help. The Spartans, however, were in the middle of a religious festival and said they couldn't march until the full moon. Athens was on its own. The Athenian generals were divided. Some wanted to hide behind the city walls, but one charismatic leader, Miltiades, argued for a daring plan: meet the Persians on the battlefield. He convinced them that a defensive siege would just lead to starvation and betrayal. So, the Athenian hoplites, their citizen soldiers, marched out to Marathon. For several days, the two armies faced each other in a tense standoff. The Persians had cavalry and archers. The Greeks had their heavy bronze armor and their signature phalanx formation, a wall of shields and spears. Miltiades knew he had to act before the Persian cavalry could be effectively deployed. He devised a brilliant, unconventional strategy. He deliberately weakened the center of his battle line and reinforced the flanks. His plan was a huge gamble. As the battle began, the Greek center did exactly what Miltiades expected. It buckled and retreated under the pressure of the main Persian force. But this was the trap. As the Persians surged forward, thinking they were winning, the strengthened Greek flank swung inwards like a pair of pincers and enveloped the Persian soldiers. Chaos erupted in the Persian ranks. Trapped and surrounded, they broke and fled back to their ships. The Athenians had achieved a stunning, almost unbelievable victory against a far superior force. It was a victory that sent a shockwave through the Greek world. A small city-state had stood up to the mighty Persian Empire and won. The legend of Marathon was born, a symbol of freedom's triumph over tyranny. But this was only the beginning. The Persians were humiliated, and their desire for revenge would only grow stronger. 10 years passed. Darius the Great died, and his son, Xerxes I, inherited the throne and his father's obsession with conquering Greece. Xerxes wasn't going to make the same mistake. He amassed an army of staggering proportions, what ancient historians described as the largest army ever assembled. We're talking hundreds of thousands of soldiers and over 1,000 ships. His plan was to crush Greece by sheer overwhelming force. In 480 BC, this colossal force began its march, crossing into Europe over a specially constructed bridge of boats. The invasion was on a scale the world had never seen, and this time, the Greek city-states knew that no single city could stand against it. The threat was so immense that it finally did the impossible. It united them. Under the leadership of Sparta, a Hellenic League was formed. About 30 city-states, including rivals Athens and Sparta, put aside their differences to face the common enemy. Their strategy was to use Greece's mountainous terrain to their advantage, to find narrow passes where the Persians' numerical superiority would mean nothing. The first and most legendary of these stands took place at a narrow coastal pass called Thermopylae, which means hot gates. Here, a small Greek force, led by the Spartan king Leonidas and his 300 elite royal guards, prepared to block the massive Persian army. They were joined by a few thousand other Greeks, but they were still impossibly outnumbered. For 2 days, the Greeks held the pass. The tight space was perfect for the hoplite phalanx. The Persians, funneled into this bottleneck, couldn't bring their full numbers to bear. Wave after wave of Xerxes' best troops, including his elite immortals, were thrown against the Greek wall of shields and spears, and wave after wave were repulsed with heavy losses. Xerxes, watching from a nearby hill, is said to have leaped from his throne in frustration 3 times. But the Greeks' heroic stand couldn't last forever. A local trader, seeking a reward, showed the Persians a hidden mountain path that would allow them to outflank the Greek position. When Leonidas learned he was being surrounded, he knew the battle was lost. He dismissed the bulk of the Greek army, ordering them to retreat and prepare for future battles. But he and his 300 Spartans, along with a contingent of Thespians who refused to leave, chose to stay. They would fight to the last man, buying precious time for the rest of Greece to organize its defenses. Their final stand became the stuff of legend, fighting with spears, then swords, then with their bare hands and teeth. They were eventually overwhelmed and killed. But their sacrifice was not in vain. It became an immortal rallying cry for all of Greece, a timeless story of courage and defiance in the face of impossible odds. While Leonidas and his men were making their heroic stand at Thermopylae, a naval battle was raging nearby at Artemisium. The Greek fleet, led by the brilliant Athenian politician and general Themistocles, managed to hold off the larger Persian navy. But with the army's defeat at Thermopylae, the fleet had to withdraw. The path to Athens was now open. Themistocles knew the city couldn't be defended. He persuaded the Athenians to do something unthinkable, to abandon their homes, their temples, their entire city. They evacuated the population to the nearby island of Salamis. When Xerxes and his army arrived, they found an empty city, which they promptly burned to the ground. From Salamis, the Athenians watched their city burn, a devastating sight. It seemed like the end. But Themistocles had a plan. He was a master of strategy and deception. He knew the only hope for Greece was to lure the massive Persian fleet into a decisive battle in a place where its size would become a disadvantage. That place was the narrow straits between the island of Salamis and the mainland. To make sure the Persians took the bait, he sent a loyal servant to Xerxes with a secret message. The message claimed that Themistocles was ready to switch sides and that the Greek fleet was demoralized and planning to flee. It was a masterful piece of disinformation. Xerxes, arrogant and eager for a final victory, fell for it completely. He ordered his fleet to enter the straits and block any potential Greek escape. The Persian ships, big and cumbersome, crowded into the narrow channel. As they did, the smaller, more agile Greek triremes, which had been hiding in the bays around the island, burst out and attacked. The trap was sprung. In the tight confines, the Persian fleet descended into chaos. They couldn't maneuver. Ships got stuck, collided with each other, and became easy targets for the Greek rams. The Greek sailors, fighting for their homes and families who were watching from the shores of Salamis, fought with ferocious determination. Xerxes, who had set up a throne on a hillside to watch what he thought would be his glorious victory, instead witnessed the complete destruction of his navy. The Battle of Salamis was a catastrophic defeat for the Persians and a turning point in the war. Xerxes, his naval power shattered and his supply lines at risk, retreated with a large part of his army back to Asia. The war wasn't over yet, though. Xerxes left behind a large elite force under his general, Mardonius, to finish the conquest the following year. In 479 BC, the final major land battle of the war took place near the town of Plataea. This time, the largest Greek army ever assembled, led by the Spartans, met the remaining Persian force on an open plain. It was a long, hard-fought battle, but in the end, the discipline and heavy armor of the Greek hoplites proved superior. Mardonius was killed, and the Persian army was routed. On the very same day, according to tradition, the remnants of the Persian fleet were destroyed by the Greek navy at the Battle of Mycale in Ionia. The Persian threat to mainland Greece was over for good. The victory in the Persian Wars was a defining moment for Western civilization. For the first time, these scattered, quarrelsome city-states had acted together as Greeks, forging a common Hellenic identity built on shared language, culture, and a fierce love of freedom. The conflict created a powerful narrative of West versus East, of democracy versus despotism, of liberty versus tyranny, a narrative that has echoed down through the centuries. And out of the ashes of this great war, one city emerged more powerful and influential than any other: Athens. Their city was destroyed, but their spirit was not. Their navy, the key to the victory at Salamis, was now the most dominant force in the Aegean Sea. They had proven their courage at Marathon and their strategic brilliance at Salamis. In the next chapter of our story, we'll see how Athens used this newfound power to build an empire of its own and usher in a golden age of culture, philosophy, and democracy that would lay the very foundations of the modern world. We're stepping into what is arguably one of the most brilliant and influential periods in all of human civilization, the Golden Age of Athens. Fasten your seatbelts, because we're about to witness a city that didn't just build monuments of stone, but also constructed the very foundations of Western thought. So, how did this incredible era begin? In our last episode, we saw the Greeks, led by Athens, fend off the mighty Persian Empire. That victory didn't just secure their freedom. It filled the Athenians with an unprecedented sense of confidence and purpose. And at the helm, steering the city-state into this new dawn, was a man named Pericles. Pericles wasn't a king or a tyrant. He was a statesman, an orator, and a general. But most importantly, he was a champion of the people. He believed that power shouldn't be concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy aristocrats, but should belong to the citizens themselves. And under his guidance, Athens developed something truly revolutionary: the world's first large-scale democracy. Now, this wasn't like our modern representative democracies where we elect people to make decisions for us. In Athens, the citizens ruled directly. Imagine a city where thousands of ordinary people, farmers, potters, merchants, would gather in an assembly, the ecclesia, to debate laws, declare war, and make all major state decisions. They would vote by a simple show of hands. Furthermore, to ensure that even the poorest citizens could afford to take time off work to participate in civic duties, like serving on juries, Pericles introduced a system of public pay. This was a radical idea. It meant that your wealth, or lack thereof, didn't prevent you from having a voice in your government. This system empowered the common man and created a level of civic engagement that was unheard of. Of course, it's crucial to remember that citizen was a limited term. It excluded women, slaves, and foreign residents, who made up a significant portion of the population. Nevertheless, for its time, this experiment in direct democracy was a groundbreaking leap forward for human governance. With this new political energy surging through the city, Pericles launched one of the most ambitious public works projects in history. He famously declared that Athens should be adorned and beautified to reflect its glory and to provide work for its people. The focus of this grand vision was a rocky outcrop overlooking the city, the Acropolis. Using funds from the Delian League, an alliance of Greek city-states that Athens had come to dominate, the city was transformed into a breathtaking spectacle of architectural genius. The centerpiece, of course, was the magnificent Parthenon, a temple dedicated to the city's patron goddess, Athena. Designed by the architects Ictinus and Callicrates, with its stunning sculptures overseen by the master artist Phidias, the Parthenon was more than just a building. It was a mathematical and artistic masterpiece. The architects used subtle optical illusions, like slightly curving the columns and the temple floor, to make the structure appear perfectly straight and harmonious to the human eye. It was a testament to the Athenian ideals of balance, order, and perfection. Imagine seeing this colossal temple, gleaming with white marble and adorned with vibrant sculptures, standing proudly against the blue Aegean sky. It was a powerful symbol of Athenian wealth, power, and cultural supremacy. But the Golden Age wasn't just about politics and buildings. It was a period of staggering intellectual and cultural ferment. It was as if the collective mind of the city had burst open, producing a supernova of creative genius that still illuminates our world today. Let's start with philosophy, which literally means love of wisdom. Wandering the bustling marketplaces, or the agora, you might have encountered a rather peculiar-looking man named Socrates. He didn't write any books, but his influence is immeasurable. He would approach people, from powerful politicians to humble craftsmen, and engage them in a series of probing questions, forcing them to examine their own beliefs about justice, virtue, and knowledge. This method, now known as the Socratic method, was revolutionary. It taught people not what asterisk to think, but asterisk how asterisk to think critically. Socrates' famous motto, "The unexamined life is not worth living," became the clarion call for Western philosophy. His most famous student was Plato, who, devastated by Socrates' execution, went on to establish his own school, the Academy. Plato's writings, which often feature Socrates as the main character, explore profound questions about reality, ethics, and politics. He gave us the famous allegory of the cave, questioning the nature of our perceived reality, and in his work, The Republic, he envisioned an ideal state ruled by philosopher kings. Plato, in turn, taught another giant of thought, Aristotle, whose work would come to dominate Western science and logic for nearly 2 millennia. Think about that. In one small city, in a relatively short span of time, you have this direct lineage of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, the foundational trio of all Western philosophy. At the same time, another art form was being born in the great open-air theaters of Athens, drama. The Athenians invented both tragedy and comedy. At huge festivals like the Dionysia, the entire city would gather to watch plays that explored the deepest aspects of the human condition. Playwrights like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides wrote powerful tragedies. Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, for instance, is a timeless psychological thriller about fate, pride, and the catastrophic consequences of uncovering a terrible truth. These plays weren't just entertainment. They were a form of public discourse, grappling with complex moral and political issues in front of the entire citizen body. And for a bit of comic relief, you had playwrights like Aristophanes, who wrote brilliant comedies that satirized politicians, philosophers, and even the gods themselves. His plays were a testament to the freedom of speech that flourished in Athenian democracy, where no public figure, not even the powerful Pericles, was safe from being mocked on stage. Finally, this era gave us the very discipline we are engaged in right now, history. Two men, in particular, pioneered the craft of recording and analyzing the past. The first was Herodotus, often called the father of history. He traveled extensively, collecting stories and accounts of the Persian Wars. While he sometimes included myths and legends, his ambition was to explain why asterisk events happened, moving beyond simple chronicles of kings and battles. He was followed by Thucydides, a general who wrote a meticulous and analytical account of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. Thucydides was different. He rejected supernatural explanations and focused purely on human motivations, power politics, and the consequences of political decisions. His work is a masterclass in political science and is still studied today by military leaders and diplomats for its timeless insights into war and human nature. So when we talk about the Golden Age of Athens, we're talking about a truly unique moment in time. Under the leadership of Pericles, this single city gave birth to direct democracy, built architectural wonders like the Parthenon, and laid the foundations for philosophy, theater, and history as we know them. It was an age of unparalleled confidence, creativity, and intellectual curiosity. It was a time when a group of citizens dared to believe they could shape their own destiny, question everything, and create a society that strived for beauty, truth, and justice. Of course, this golden age was not destined to last forever. The very forces that propelled Athens to greatness would also lead to its eventual downfall, a story we will explore in our next episode. We've witnessed the dazzling heights of the Golden Age, a time of unparalleled achievement in art, philosophy, and democracy, all centered in the magnificent city of Athens. But every Golden Age has its sunset, and for Greece, the dusk came in the form of a long, brutal, and self-inflicted wound, the Peloponnesian War. This wasn't a war against a foreign invader like Persia. This was a civil war, a conflict that pitted Greek against Greek, brother against brother. Imagine the United States, after winning the Revolutionary War, immediately descending into a 30-year conflict between the North and the South. That's the scale of the tragedy we're about to explore. For nearly 3 decades, the Greek world tore itself apart, and by the end, nothing would ever be the same. So, how did it come to this? How did the two heroes of the Persian Wars, Athens and Sparta, become such bitter enemies? It was a classic tale of two superpowers with fundamentally different worldviews. On one side, you had the Athenian Empire, a naval power built on trade, democracy, and tribute from its allies in the Delian League. Athens was dynamic, innovative, and expansionist. On the other side, you had Sparta and its Peloponnesian League, a land-based military power, conservative, oligarchic, and deeply suspicious of Athens's growing influence. Think of it as a Cold War in the ancient world. The tension had been simmering for decades, with minor conflicts and proxy wars flaring up across Greece. Sparta and its allies feared Athens was becoming a tyrant, turning the Delian League into a personal empire and threatening their traditional way of life. Athens, in turn, saw Sparta as a roadblock to progress, a stagnant power determined to hold back the tide of history. The final spark could have been anything, and it was. A series of disputes in smaller city-states like Corcyra and Potidaea pulled the two great powers into a direct collision course. In 431 BC, the fragile peace shattered and the Peloponnesian War began. The war started with a seemingly clear strategy on both sides. Pericles, the great Athenian statesman, knew they couldn't beat the legendary Spartan army on land. So, his plan was to use Athens's long walls, fortifications that connected the city to its port, Piraeus, as an impenetrable shield. The entire population of the surrounding countryside, Attica, would retreat behind these walls. Meanwhile, the mighty Athenian navy would control the seas, raiding the Peloponnesian coast and ensuring a steady flow of supplies and tribute from their empire. Athens would become an island. Sparta's strategy was the opposite. March their invincible hoplite army into Attica each year, burn the crops, and try to lure the Athenians out for a decisive battle they knew they'd win. For the first few years, it was a stalemate. The Spartans would invade, the Athenians would hide, and the Athenian navy would raid. It seemed like a war of attrition that Athens, with its vast wealth, could sustain. But then, an unforeseen enemy struck Athens, one far more deadly than any Spartan spear. In the second year of the war, with the city packed to bursting with refugees from the countryside, disaster struck. A terrifying plague swept through Athens. The conditions were perfect for disease: overcrowded, unsanitary, and a population under immense stress. The historian Thucydides, who survived it himself, left a horrifying account. People were struck with high fevers, violent coughing, and extreme thirst. The disease was so virulent that it overwhelmed the city's social fabric. Laws were ignored, religious rituals abandoned. People died so quickly that bodies were left in the streets or thrown onto mass funeral pyres. No one knew what it was or how to stop it. It's estimated that the plague killed up to a third of Athens' population, including soldiers, sailors, and its brilliant leader, Pericles. This was a catastrophic blow. Not only did it cripple Athens' manpower, but it also robbed the city of its visionary leadership. After Pericles, Athenian politics became more radical and unstable, led by demagogues who often pushed for more aggressive and risky strategies, a far cry from Pericles' cautious and defensive plan. The plague didn't end the war, but it fundamentally changed Athens, leaving it weakened, demoralized, and politically fractured. Even after the devastation of the plague, the war dragged on for another 2 decades. There were temporary truces, most notably the Peace of Nicias, but the deep-seated hatred and suspicion were too strong for any peace to last. The conflict entered a new, even more brutal phase. It was no longer just about Athens and Sparta. It was a global war for the Greek world, pulling in city-states from Sicily in the west to Ionia in the east. Alliances shifted, and atrocities became commonplace. One of the darkest moments was the Melian dialogue, recorded by Thucydides. When the small island of Melos tried to remain neutral, Athens sent envoys. The Melians appealed to justice and the gods. The Athenians gave a chillingly pragmatic response. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. When Melos refused to submit, the Athenians conquered the island, executed all the adult men, and sold the women and children into slavery. This event showed how far Athens had strayed from the idealistic principles of its golden age. The war was corroding the very soul of Greece. Then came the turning point, a gamble so audacious, so overconfident, that it would seal Athens' fate, the Sicilian expedition. In 415 BC, buoyed by a temporary advantage in the war, some Athenian leaders convinced the assembly to launch a massive military expedition to conquer the wealthy city of Syracuse in Sicily. The plan was incredibly ambitious: to gain a new source of wealth and power and cut off the Peloponnesian grain supply. The expedition was launched with great fanfare. It was the largest and most magnificent force ever to leave a Greek harbor, but the entire campaign was a disaster from start to finish. The commanders bickered, the strategy was flawed, and the Syracusans, reinforced by Spartan advisors, put up a ferocious defense. What was meant to be a swift victory turned into a long, grueling siege. The Athenian forces were trapped, their supplies dwindled, and their morale collapsed. They attempted a desperate retreat overland, but they were hounded and eventually cornered. The Athenian army was completely annihilated. Thousands were killed or captured. Those who were taken prisoner were thrown into stone quarries, where most perished from starvation and exposure. The Sicilian disaster was a blow from which Athens would never fully recover. They lost 200 ships and tens of thousands of their best soldiers and sailors, an entire generation of men. News of the defeat sent shockwaves through the Greek world. Athens' enemies were emboldened, and its allies in the Delian League began to revolt, sensing the empire was crumbling. Even Sparta, traditionally a land power, saw its opportunity. With financial aid from an old enemy, Persia, who was delighted to see the Greeks destroying each other, the Spartans began to build a navy capable of challenging Athens on the seas. For several more years, a desperate Athens fought on, winning some surprising naval victories. But their resources were gone, their treasury was empty, and their spirit was broken. The final act came in 405 BC at the Battle of Aegospotami. The Spartan navy, under the cunning general Lysander, caught the Athenian fleet completely by surprise on a beach and destroyed it. With its navy gone, Athens was defenseless. The city was blockaded and facing starvation. Athens finally surrendered in 404 BC. The terms of surrender were humiliating. Athens was forced to tear down its long walls, the symbol of its power and security. Its empire was dismantled, and its democracy was replaced by a brutal oligarchy loyal to Sparta. Known as the 30 Tyrants, the Peloponnesian War was over. But there were no real winners. Sparta's victory was hollow. The war had exhausted every city-state involved. The Greek world was financially ruined, its population decimated, and its confidence shattered. The spirit of cooperation that had defeated the Persians was replaced by a legacy of bitterness and mistrust. The golden age of Athens was brought to a tragic and definitive end. The intellectual and artistic flames weren't extinguished overnight, but the creative energy and optimistic spirit that had defined the 5th century were gone, replaced by cynicism and exhaustion. The war left a power vacuum and a weakened Greece that, in the next century, would become vulnerable to a new, rising power from the North Macedonia, led by Philip II and his son, Alexander the Great. But that is a story for our next episode. It's a powerful lesson in how quickly greatness can be undone from within. If you found this history compelling, please hit that like button and be sure to subscribe. We witnessed the brutal, decades-long Peloponnesian War, a conflict that pitted Greek against Greek and left the Hellenic world exhausted and deeply scarred. Today, in our final chapter, we explore the aftermath of that devastating war, the twilight of the independent city-state and the astonishing rise of a new power from the north, Macedon. Imagine the Greek world after the Peloponnesian War. The once mighty Athens was humbled, its empire gone. Sparta, the victor, proved to be a harsh and clumsy hegemon, quickly alienating its former allies. The result was not peace but a chaotic power vacuum. The decades that followed were a whirlwind of shifting alliances and constant, debilitating warfare. Thebes rose to prominence for a time, then Sparta reasserted itself, then Athens tried to rebuild its influence. It was a vicious cycle of conflict, a political quagmire that drained the city-states of their wealth, their manpower, and, most importantly, their unity. They were so focused on fighting each other that they failed to notice the storm gathering on their northern frontier. While the Peleus of the south were bleeding each other dry, a remarkable transformation was taking place in the kingdom of Macedon. For centuries, the Greeks had viewed the Macedonians as semi-barbaric, rustic cousins, speaking a different dialect of Greek and living under a monarchy rather than in a polis. But that perception was about to change, thanks to one of the most brilliant and ambitious figures in ancient history, King Philip II. When Philip ascended to the throne in 359 BC, Macedon was a weak and fractured kingdom on the brink of collapse. But Philip was a visionary. He was a master of both diplomacy and military innovation. He reorganized the Macedonian army, creating the formidable Macedonian phalanx. This wasn't your typical Greek phalanx. Philip armed his soldiers with the sarissa, a brutally effective pike that was nearly 18 feet long, far longer than the traditional Greek spear. This allowed his formations to engage the enemy from a greater distance and with multiple spear points, creating an almost impenetrable wall of steel. He also developed a highly effective combined arms approach, integrating his elite cavalry, light infantry, and powerful siege engines with his core phalanx. Philip didn't just build an army. He forged a state-of-the-art military machine. With this new power at his command, Philip turned his gaze south. He was patient and cunning, a master of strategy. He didn't just march in and declare war. Instead, he exploited the existing rivalries among the Greek city-states. He would offer his help to one polis against another, intervening in their squabbles, and then, once invited in, he would never quite leave. He used bribery, diplomacy, and threats, slowly but surely extending his influence. He secured control of vital gold mines in Thrace, which gave him a seemingly endless treasury to fund his ambitions and buy loyalty. One by one, the cities of northern and central Greece fell under his sway. In Athens, one voice rose in alarm. The great orator Demosthenes saw the threat Philip posed with crystal clarity. In a series of powerful speeches known as the Philippics, he passionately warned his fellow citizens, urging them to put aside their differences and unite against the Macedonian king. He called Philip a tyrant, a barbarian bent on destroying their freedom. But his warnings often fell on deaf ears. Many Athenians were weary of war, while others were bribed by Philip's gold or simply failed to recognize the gravity of the situation until it was too late. The Greeks, tragically, could not overcome the fatal flaw that had plagued them for centuries: their inability to unite, even in the face of a common existential threat. Finally, the decisive moment arrived. In 338 BC, a coalition of Greek forces, led by the traditional rivals Athens and Thebes, at last put aside their differences to make a final stand. On the plains of Chaeronea in Boeotia, they met Philip's Macedonian army. The battle was a testament to Philip's military genius. On the Macedonian right flank, he commanded his phalanx, while on the left, he placed his elite companion cavalry under the command of his teenage son, a young man named Alexander. Philip executed a brilliant feigned retreat with his right wing, drawing the Athenian hoplites forward and creating a gap in the Greek line. At that precise moment, Alexander charged with the cavalry, smashing into the gap and shattering the Theban sacred band. an elite unit of 300 soldiers thought to be invincible. With their flank collapsing and the Macedonian phalanx pressing its relentless advance, the Greek line broke. The defeat was total. The Battle of Chaeronea was more than just a military victory. It was the end of an era. The age of the independent, freewheeling Greek polis, which had given the world so much in art, philosophy, and democracy, was over. Philip, now the undisputed master of Greece, was surprisingly lenient in victory. He didn't sack Athens or Thebes. Instead, he gathered the Greek states into a new alliance, the League of Corinth, with himself as its leader, or hegemon. His ultimate plan was now revealed: to lead a unified Greco-Macedonian army in a great war of revenge against the Persian Empire, the ancient enemy of the Greeks. The stage was set for the largest invasion the world had ever seen. But fate had one last, dramatic twist in store. In 336 BC, just as he was finalizing preparations for his Persian campaign, Philip II was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards during his daughter's wedding celebration. His grand plan seemed to die with him. The subdued Greek state stirred, sensing an opportunity to regain their freedom. But they underestimated his heir. The throne of Macedon, and with it, command of the most powerful army in the world and lordship over all of Greece, passed to his 20-year-old son, Alexander. This was the young man who had led the decisive cavalry charge at Chaeronea, who had been tutored by the great philosopher Aristotle, and who possessed an ambition that dwarfed even his father's. A new age was dawning. The story of classical Greece concludes here, but it sets the stage for one of the most incredible sagas in human history, the conquests of Alexander the Great, a story for another time. This journey through the incredible world of ancient Greece, it's a story of breathtaking creativity, fierce independence, and ultimately, tragic self-destruction, but its legacy continues to shape our world in countless ways.